Premature baby or pregnant royal bride? That's the question at the heart of today's episode of History Calling, as we look at the case of Prince Arthur Tudor, who was born on the 19th of September 1486, barely 8 months after the wedding of his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So was he born too soon, or was Elizabeth already expecting when she said "I do"? And would that have affected Arthur's claim on the English crown? Let's take a look at the evidence for this potential royal scandal and see what you think. Just before I jump in, please remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that you never miss an upload. For bonus material from me, you can also become a YouTube member by clicking the join button underneath my videos, or head on over to my Patreon site where I share weekly bonuses like early access to ad-free videos and mini podcasts. If you join my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, you can get 2 free downloads, and if you have Irish ancestry, you might like to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, which is available as an ebook and a paperback from Amazon. All the links you'll need are in the description box. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were married on the 18th of January 1486. They had been pre-contracted for some time already, Henry having promised to marry her back in 1483, and although some have questioned why it took him so long to go through with it after seizing the throne in August 1485, in actual fact there were numerous legal hoops to jump through before the wedding could take place, and things moved reasonably fast, all things considered. Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Edward IV, had been declared illegitimate by the previous king, her paternal uncle Richard III, and Henry had to get that reversed by his parliament in November, who then petitioned him to marry her as soon as possible in December. The two were also distant cousins, however, and so the Pope had to be applied to for a dispensation to allow them to wed. In the event, the ceremony went ahead before the relevant paperwork had arrived from Rome, which didn't happen until March 1486, but a papal legate then in England had given the go-ahead 2 days before the wedding, and when the dispensation did appear, it regularised the whole thing, stating that the Pope, quote, "by the counsel and consent of his College of Cardinals, approveth, confirmeth, and stablisheth the matrimony and conjunction made between our Sovereign Lord King Henry VII of the House of Lancaster of that one party, and the noble Princess Elizabeth of the House of York of that other, with all their issue lawfully born between the same." The point about the union's issue was especially important as it soon became clear that the new queen was pregnant. At the end of August, she removed to Winchester, long associated with the mythical hero King Arthur, to give birth. It was there that she welcomed her first son, named after the legendary figure, and who arrived a day shy of 35 weeks after her wedding. So was the new little prince premature, or was Elizabeth pregnant before she walked down the aisle? The evidence is deeply conflicting. In support of the notion that Arthur was a full-term baby is the fact that he had a very large, high-profile christening in Winchester Cathedral on the 24th of September, when he was only a few days old. Does the fact that he was deemed strong enough to be put through this not suggest a healthy child who didn't need a hurried emergency baptism in the delivery room, as we might expect to see had he been early? Bear in mind too how dicey his situation would have been in 1486 if he'd been that premature. A 35-week gestation wouldn't be a big deal now in a modern first world country, and assuming there were no other health issues, but in the 15th century it put Arthur right at the edge of viability. There are instances of babies being born at that age and earlier and surviving. George III arrived at only around 7 months gestation in 1738, and he did have an emergency baptism, but they are vastly outnumbered by the ones who died. I also think that had he been early and in danger, yet clearly survived, there was a great opportunity there to present him as a little miracle baby, born too soon, yet somehow living as though he was a sign of God's favour on the new Tudor dynasty. But this never happened. If he was small and weak, it is strange too that there was apparently no rush for Elizabeth to get pregnant again to create a spare for this fragile heir. Her next child, Princess Margaret, would not be born until November 1489, and there are no records of miscarriages. Nor does her childbearing record suggest that she had trouble conceiving. She would have at least 7 children, one of whom she conceived mere weeks after Arthur's death in 1502, indicating that when she wanted to get pregnant, she could do so, and very quickly. This apparent fertility and the gap between Arthur and his sister might also suggest that the baby appeared healthy enough. On the flip side, though, Elizabeth suffered from what was called an ague after Arthur's birth, and perhaps that negative experience explains why she wanted to wait before venturing into pregnancy again. David Starkey argues in support of Arthur being premature in his book, Henry Virtuous Prince, partly on the basis that the baby's birth came barely 3 weeks after the Queen's arrival at Winchester. The insinuation is that Elizabeth would have left London earlier if she'd thought the child would arrive when he did. But I don't subscribe to this line of thought myself, as I think a 2 to 2.5 week interlude seems reasonable enough and doesn't suggest that she got her dates wrong by a whole month. Starkey even wonders if the bumpy journey there caused an early labour, but again I don't agree because I don't think there would have been such a long delay between the journey and the birth in that case. Had the trip been enough to cause Elizabeth to go into labour, I think it would have happened more or less immediately, maybe even on the road. More convincing is the hypothesis that the birth must have been earlier than expected because the intended godfather, the Earl of Oxford, was still 100 miles away, necessitating a delay in the christening to allow him time to arrive, though he still only got there in the middle of the ceremony. All this is just circumstantial evidence, though. What about the written record? Starting with the sources dating to the year of his birth, we have a note written in the Book of Hours of his paternal grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, which you can see in this portrait of her, and which states the day and time of his arrival, but makes no mention of him being early. Then we have 3 celebratory poems written in Latin to mark the occasion. These were composed by Bernard André, who had known Henry VII for years and would later be Arthur's tutor, Giovanni Gigle, an Italian churchman raised in England, and Pietro Carmeliano, another Italian intellectual who had been in England for several years. None of them would have been at the delivery, of course, but they were all contemporaries who were either at court or well placed to get court news, and who might be expected to hear about the birth soon after it happened. Yet none of them mention an early, and therefore presumably small and sickly baby either. However, we do have a very interesting quote from a later work by André. Starting in 1500, he wrote a history of King Henry VII at that king's request, and in it he said that Elizabeth had conceived within days of the wedding. We don't know if this is true, of course, but it's the nearest thing we have to a contemporary claim that Arthur must have been premature, though in the following paragraph, when he discusses the prince's birth, André makes no mention of an early delivery. Moving forwards in time to the reign of Arthur's little brother, Henry VIII, we have several histories and chronicles which mention the birth. Polydore Vergil, writing in the early 1510s, says only that King Henry VII, after a few days, left for Winchester, where his wife, Queen Elizabeth, had given birth to a son whom he named Arthur. There's not a word said about the baby's health or the short gap between the wedding and the birth. In Robert Fabyan's Chronicle, and he died in 1513, so again this dates to within living memory of Arthur's birth, he records of the year 1486 that, "In this year the king married King Edward's eldest daughter named Elizabeth, and in the month of September was born Prince Arthur." Again, nothing about a premature delivery. A slightly later source, but still written within living memory, is Edward Hall's Chronicle. Hall died in 1547, having not completed this work yet, but he had written up everything up to the year 1532. His publisher later wrote up the rest using Hall's notes, and so had already covered Arthur's birth. He said that King Henry went from London to Winchester, quote, "where Queen Elizabeth his wife was delivered of a fair prince named Arthur." Heading into the 17th century, we have John Speed's book on the history of Great Britain, published in 1611, which says, "Arthur, the eldest son of King Henry VII and of Queen Elizabeth his wife, was born at Winchester the 20th day of September, the year of grace 1486, and the second of his father's reign. Assuming Margaret Beaufort's information was correct, that Arthur was born on the 19th, Speed gets the day of the birth slightly wrong, a mistake which is often repeated, including, gulp, by me in my videos on Elizabeth of York, where I somehow also got the date of the marriage slightly wrong. Sorry. But he is otherwise correct, and like the Henrican writers, he does not mention a premature delivery. In fact, the earliest indisputable account we have of such a delivery comes a decade later in the work of Francis Bacon. In 1621, he wrote a biography of Henry VII, which included the following line: "The child was strong and able, though he was born in the 8th month, which the physicians do prejudge." This claim would later be picked up on by other writers, including Thomas Fuller, who cited Bacon and Speed when he said in a book of 1662 that Arthur, eldest son to King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth, was born, being partus octomestrius, meaning parted in the 8th month, yet vital and vigorous, contrary to the rules of physicians, at Winchester, the 20th day of September, 1486. So André's comment about Elizabeth's conception date, Bacon's book, and the fact that we now understand that a pregnancy should last an average of 40 weeks provide the strongest evidence for those claiming that Arthur was born too soon. If I've missed something though, and there is another source, let me know and I'll put a reference to it in the pinned comment under this video. Now, André knew the royal family intimately. He was Arthur's personal tutor, and so we could look at his credibility in two ways. One, he was well placed to know the truth, but two, he might also have wanted to help cover up for a pregnancy which began before the 18th of January marriage ceremony to protect his pupil and his benefactor Henry VII. What about Bacon though? He was writing 135 years later and his work is unsourced, so is there any particular reason we should believe what he said? The circumstances around the writing of Francis Bacon's biography of Henry VII were somewhat unfortunate. He had been impeached on corruption charges that year and forced to surrender his post as Lord Chancellor and head of the High Court of Chancery. After that, he went back to his house at Gormanbury, and in the space of 14 weeks between June and the start of October, he wrote up his biography of the long since deceased king. Now, this would be ridiculously fast to write a book even today with online sources and computers, never mind in 1621 when everything had to be checked and written up by hand. But according to Brian Vickers, who has written about the book's publication, Bacon had been mulling the project over for many years and already had much of it written. This would help to account for the speed at which the final manuscript appears and eases some of my concerns about its quality. Vickers, whose article on this topic I'll leave details of below, also states that Bacon was able to access primary source manuscripts, sometimes using the help of intermediaries, though he did also rely to a large extent on published works. Again, this is reassuring, and perhaps he saw André's work and extrapolated from that. However, it doesn't change the fact that Bacon doesn't cite any source for the detail about Arthur being premature, and while he might have seen André's incomplete book on Henry VII, or had access to something else now lost to history, I have to wonder if he just added in the point about Arthur's prematurity in order to keep King James I, who took a keen interest in his work, happy. James was a descendant of Henry and Elizabeth's who relied on his Tudor blood to hold the English throne, and he was also a Protestant, who may not have looked kindly on the idea that his ancestors were sleeping together before a formal wedding, though that may not have been as much of an issue in the 15th century, but you'll have to keep watching to hear why. If Bacon wasn't going to gloss over the short period of time between the wedding and Arthur's birth, then prematurity was the simplest option available, which wouldn't involve a possible stain on the royal name. Now, to go back to the contemporary and near-contemporary writers, we might claim that they hushed up Arthur's weak condition at birth to project an image of strength for the new Tudor dynasty. However, if he was early, small, and weaker than usual as a result, could this really have been hidden so well from contemporaries? Surely all the people at the christening would have noticed his condition. We could also argue that none, even André, really make anything out of the unusually short period between his parents' wedding and his birth because they were being diplomatic, and trying to avoid angering the King and Queen by pointing out what anyone with a knowledge of childbirth must have suspected, that the shockingly healthy baby, born less than 35 weeks after the wedding, must have been conceived before it. Now, of course, this argument does rely on the idea that people would have known how long a pregnancy should have been, and certainly there's some wiggle room there. Understanding of these sorts of things was more limited in the 15th century, but at the same time, people weren't stupid. They could do maths, and enough honeymoon babies will have existed for it to be common enough knowledge that a gestation of 35 weeks was less than the average. If he was full term, though, why did Elizabeth and Henry not just claim that he wasn't, in order to offset suspicions of premarital relations between them? Wouldn't that have been the smart thing to do to avoid a scandal? Well, no, actually. There is in fact a way to explain a pregnancy which predated the wedding without impeaching Henry and Elizabeth's honour, and it all comes down to understanding the nature of medieval marriages and what constituted them. In essence, all you needed for a valid marriage in the eyes of the church at the time were two consenting single adults, and by adult I mean 14 or older for a boy and 12 or older for a girl, who agreed to be husband and wife either right away or at some point in the future, and then slept together. Even if they were distant cousins and therefore related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity or affinity, that marriage would be very, very hard to break. Of course, it was wise to have witnesses to any informal ceremony so that it couldn't be denied later on. Lady Catherine Grey would learn this the hard way in the following century when she wed with only the priest, who then disappeared, and one witness, who then died, in attendance, and saw her marriage declared void by Elizabeth I. I'll leave my video on Catherine's life linked below for you if you'd like to learn more. Henry and Elizabeth had no such problem. They'd been publicly betrothed for years, and so could have started sleeping together even before the ceremony and before the papal paperwork for the dispensation had come through, with the eventual ceremony being more of a formality to make the whole thing public. This might even be seen as more likely when we remember Parliament's petition to Henry to wed the princess sooner rather than later in December 1485. If they'd had to admit that Elizabeth was pregnant before the official ceremony took place, they could still have claimed to be married, even if it had been done somewhat irregularly. This explanation would allow for a full-term pregnancy which predated the wedding, yet still allow Arthur to have been conceived in a state which medieval observers would have called wedlock, with Andre and the other contemporary writers just preferring not to mention it out of an abundance of delicacy and respect towards their royal patrons. Unfortunately, this line of argument is not well understood in the modern era, and it doesn't appear in the best known depiction of Henry and Elizabeth's marriage, which is the novel The White Princess. This is a piece of historical fiction written by author Philippa Gregory and later turned into a TV show of the same name, starring Jodie Comer as the titular character, Queen Elizabeth. The plot here has Elizabeth become pregnant before the marriage because Henry and his mother won't commit to the union unless she proves able to conceive. This is ludicrous, has no basis in any evidence, and no princess of England would have agreed to such treatment, risking the total ruin of her reputation and the possible damnation of her soul. But sadly, this is the kind of place where a lot of people get their history nowadays, and so many buy into it with no further thought. What it fails to show is that if Henry and Elizabeth, who had already publicly agreed to marry each other, remember, had slept together, that would have made their union binding. Henry couldn't have just dumped her, and if he tried to, then any children he had with another woman while Elizabeth lived would always have been under the shadow of illegitimacy, thanks to this earlier consummated pre-contract. In order to maintain his alliance with the House of York, he would also have had to marry her younger sister. But once he'd slept with Elizabeth, this would have put him within the prohibited degrees of affinity with her sisters and led to all sorts of additional problems. Famously, their younger son, Henry VIII, would get out of his marriage to Arthur's widow on this very pretext. Once this pair slept together, they were, to all intents and purposes, married. So there we have it. That's all the evidence I've been able to amass on Arthur's birth. I have to admit that we're never going to know for sure if he was premature or full term and conceived before his parents' official wedding. But in the course of putting this video together, I find my own viewpoint shifting from the first option, which is what I came to the video thinking, to the second, largely because I don't think there was anything to prevent Henry and Elizabeth sleeping together before the 18th of January 1486, especially knowing that their dispensation was on the way, and I don't see any evidence that Arthur was in the kind of weak state that I would expect from a child of barely 35 weeks gestation. If he was conceived before the wedding, though, would this have affected his claim on the throne? No, I don't think so. Anne Boleyn was clearly pregnant before her marriage to Henry VIII in January 1536, but Princess Elizabeth was still considered legitimate at the time of her birth, under English law only admittedly, which by then didn't recognise her father's first marriage. And when she was later declared illegitimate, it was because her mother's marriage had been totally voided, not because Elizabeth had been conceived before it took place. Arthur was born during wedlock. That's what ultimately mattered, not when he was conceived. Had he lived long enough, he would have become king, and that 35-week gap between his parents' official wedding and his birth wouldn't have been an issue. I'm interested to hear what your opinion of his birth is, though. Premature or full term? Let me know your thoughts below, and if you want to know more about Arthur's life and death, including whether he slept with his wife Catherine of Aragon, try one of these videos next. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.